Okay, today we're going to be talking about point of view. Remember, point of view is what the character thinks and feels about other characters or events that are happening in the story. So today we're going to look at Marco from the new Hoop, and we're going to think about his actions, what he does, and his words, what he's saying, to figure out how he feels about something, what his point of view is. So we're going to take a look. We're going to go back to one of the sections in the new Hoop. And as we're reading this section, we're going to think about how Marco feels about reusing and recycling. So we're thinking about things that he says or things that he does that has to do with reusing and recycling. Then we're going to highlight those things. So as we're reading, I want you to think, what does he say that has to do with reusing or recycling? Or what are some things that he does, his actions, that have to do with reusing and recycling? So as we're reading, I want you to think about that. Marco and Kim walked past the city's recycling center. They waved at the manager, Mr. Morse. His job was to separate the plastic, paper, and metal items people brought to him. He was transferring cardboard from an overflowing bin into large empty containers. So in that paragraph, there's not really anything that Marco says or does that has to do with recycling besides walking by the recycling center and waving to Mr. Morse. So we don't need to highlight anything in that paragraph. Marco stared at all the old stuff. "That gives me an idea," he said. "Mr. Morse, do you have anything we could reuse to make a basketball hoop?" So in this paragraph, there is some things that Marco is saying that has to do with reusing. So let's highlight that section where he says something that has to do with reusing. "Mr. Morse, do you have anything we could reuse to make a basketball hoop?" So here, Marco is talking about asking Mr. Morse to reuse if he has anything that they can reuse to make a basketball hoop. So we're going to add what Marco said about reusing something into our graphic organizer. So here's that detail in our graphic organizer. Marco asks Mr. Morse if he has anything they could reuse to make a basketball hoop. Okay, so that has to do with reusing, and it's something Marco said. So that's going to help us, this detail is going to help us understand what Marco's point of view is. It's something he said that has to do with reusing. Okay, moving on to your turn page for today. You're going to be transferring, we're going to continue to read, and we're going to think about the things that Marco says or Marco does that has to do with recycling and reusing. So let's go through this one a little bit together. So we just read this section that he had where he asked Mr. Morse about something that they might be able to reuse to make a basketball hoop. So if we continue reading, Mr. Morse picked up a plastic laundry basket. "We were going to recycle this basket, but I think it's reusable." So that's not anything that Marco is saying or doing. That's something Mr. Morse is saying. So that's not something we should be highlighting. We're going to continue on. "It looks useless, old, and cracked," said Kim. Still not Marco. "No, it could be useful," said Marco. We can cut off the bottom to make a fine hoop, and then an adult can help us attach it to a post." This is something Marco is saying. So this part we can highlight. Let me highlight this. Okay, no, it could be useful. We can cut back over here, off the bottom to make a fine hoop. Sorry about my highlighting. It's very difficult to move on this. And then an adult can help us attach it to a post. There we go. This is something that Marco is saying. So we're going to use our type tool, come over to this section, and we're going to type into this section. Let me move it up a little bit. Let's see if I can move that up. There we go. We're going to type into this section what we just highlighted. Okay, Marco says that this can be useful and we can cut the bottom off to make a hoop. Okay, so we can type that in up in this section. So when you go to your turn, this can be the first detail that you put in. Now that we've done that one together, I want you to continue reading. So move down and, oh, let me get rid of that highlighting. Hold on. Click on this. No, it's not going to work. All right, well, you can continue moving down. Sorry about my highlighting, that won't go away. And you can continue reading. Remember to only highlight information that Marco says or that Marco does, okay? That has to do with recycling and reusing like we just did. Then type it in as your third detail. Then we're going to use this information, okay? How Marco asked Mr. Morse about reusing something as a basketball hoop, and how Marco talked about when he talked about how it could be useful, how the basket could be useful, and how they could cut it to make a fine basketball hoop. We're going to put that information plus the next detail that you find, and we're going to think about how does Marco feel, what is his point of view about reusing and recycling? What does he feel knowing that he asked Mr. Morse about the basketball hoop, something they could reuse to make it, about him actually using a basket and saying that it's useful and that it will make a fine hoop? And then the third detail that you find, what does all that tell you about how Marco feels about recycling and reusing? Then type that into your point of view. Remember to submit it when you are finished. If you have any questions while you're doing this, remember to go to Parent Square and send me a message. Send me the question.